In this lecture, let's have a brief introduction to the Python programming language. So this is the official definition of Python programming language. So Python is a high-level general-purpose programming language. Its design emphasizes code readability with the use of significant indentation, and Python is dynamically typed and garbage collected. So you might have come across this definition quite a lot if you are learning Python. But many times people actually don't know what these words mean. And oftentimes these questions are usually asked in programming interviews, like why is Python a dynamically typed language, how the garbage collection of Python works, or how exactly is Python a high-level language, so on and so forth. So in order to basically get clear of all these concepts, let's decode the statement line by line, and let's try understanding the meaning of each word. So let's first go ahead and understand why exactly is Python a high-level programming language. So even before learning that, you basically need to understand the difference between what exactly is a high-level and a low-level programming language. And in order to understand this, we need to go way back when programming first actually started. So we all know that programming is nothing, but it's basically giving instructions to a computer. Now, whenever you want to give instructions to anybody, what we do is we basically use a language, which they understand now in order to instruct a computer, or basically to instruct a CPU what exactly to do. We need to speak in a language, or we need to use a language which the computer actually understands. Now, the computer only understands binary or machine codes, which is nothing but zeros and ones. So ultimately, this is what the binary code looks like. But you'll be able to notice that all these zeros and ones are not actually understandable for humans. So we do not know what this binary code actually means. But if you take a look at any programming language, so if you take a look at this code right up over here, you will clearly be able to see that this is a basic program where we take a value 10, save it into a variable, add 2 to it, and then print that particular value. However, the problem is that CPUs do not understand this programming language, and henceforth this programming language has to be translated into machine code or binary code, and then it has to be fed to the CPU. But back in early days, we did not have languages like C, C++, and Java, and the programmers actually had to rely on writing binary code or machine code to give instructions to the CPU. And that was actually quite tedious because writing a program using machine code is extremely difficult for programmers because instead of focusing on the logic, all the programmers had to do is to figure out how exactly to give the instructions. Now, in order to solve this problem of using zeros and ones to code, what programmers did is that they used to write machine code in a more readable format, such as decimal, octal, or hexadecimal. So here's an example of what the hexadecimal code looks like. So instead of using zeros and ones, we use hexadecimal here in order to give instructions to a CPU. Now this format is still quite confusing, and it's still difficult to write programming code using this. But it's still actually better than using zeros and ones. Now, as this hexadecimal code was still difficult to use later, we had provided one abstraction level. On top of machine code, an assembly language was introduced. Now, assembly language was a lot more readable, and it was a lot more usable as compared to writing machine code. So as you can see, this is what the assembly code looks like now. Assembly language was introduced to reduce difficulty of writing machine code and assembly. Language provided one abstraction level on top of machine code, and this is what it looks like. So you'll clearly be able to see that at least we will be able to read this code and understand what exactly each line of code is doing. So here we have statements like move, we have statements like sub, add, jump, so on and so forth. So this code is still more readable as compared to machine code. And programmers actually found writing this code a lot better as compared to directly coding using machine code in assembly language. Programmers had to directly work with hardware features of the processor. That is its registers. So as you can see, this particular line of code basically means that we have to move a particular value into a CPU's register. So assembly language basically means we have to deal with the hardware of the computer directly. And this actually meant that if you are writing a program for a different hardware, you need to perform, or you need to use a different set of instructions. Now this assembly language, which we had, it was still difficult to use, and there was no human readable language back in the time. And henceforth another abstraction layer was added on top of this assembly language, and a more readable language like the C programming language was introduced. So this is what the C programming language looked like. As you can see, it's actually a lot more understandable, a lot more human readable. If you just take a look at the syntax, instead of using random letters like this, C programming language uses regular words and characters. Also, while using C, programmers do not have to directly deal with the CPU hardware or registers. So that was an added advantage, and it was more user-friendly as compared to the assembly language. And it actually improved programmers' productivity by a lot. Now we have understood 3 different languages. So on the very right-hand side, we have humans, and on the left-hand side, we have computers. Now, computers only understand machine code. Henceforth, I have placed machine code here. Normal human beings do not understand machine code, but they do understand, and they are actually able to read languages like the C programming languages. And here in the middle, we have assembly language, which is not that human-friendly, but it's not computer-friendly either. So all the languages which are more understandable to the computer are called as low-level programming languages, and all the programming languages, which are a little bit more human-readable, are called as high-level or mid-level programming languages. So in a basic sense, a programming language which is more close to humans, which is more understandable to humans, is called as a high-level language, and a programming language which is more understandable for a computer is called as a low-level programming language. And also you need to understand that even if you are writing this code in C, ultimately, before processing this code by the computer, this code ultimately gets translated to machine code. I hope this actually gives you an idea about what exactly is a high-level programming language and a low-level programming language. But what about Python? If C is called as a mid-level programming language, why is Python called as a high-level programming language? So let's take an example to understand this. Let's say you have to write a program which prints Hello World on the output screen. If you had to write this particular program, and see this is all the code which you have to write. So there's a whole bunch of code here which is still human readable, but it might be a little bit difficult for beginners to understand. So if you take a look at the C code, we have in here, we have a main, we have the parentheses, we have the opening curly bracket, the closing curly bracket, so on and so forth. And then we have a print statement, which is understandable that we have to print something. However, we have this written 0 over here as well, which makes no sense for a beginner. However, if you take a look at the same Python code, Python actually does this entire thing in one single line for printing anything on the output screen. We simply have to say print and then type in a statement which we want to print. So Python is called as a high-level programming language because it's absolutely easy for humans to read Python code and understand, and it's one of the most user-friendly languages which one could use. And henceforth we see that Python is a high-level programming language. Now even C is called as a high-level programming language, but sometimes people also refer to C as a mid-level programming language. And that's because C can actually harness the power of a hardware as well, along with being readable. And henceforth, it's often called as a mid-level programming language. So now once we understand why Python is called as a high-level programming language, in the next lecture, let's learn why Python is called as a general-purpose programming language. So let's continue this in the next one.